Hi, I'm Maura Keeney, and in this presentation I will be connecting experiential learning theory with the research process model of guided inquiry design. So, what is experiential learning theory? At its core, it gets at this 2,000-year-old quote from Aristotle about learning by doing. Experiential learning theory was first articulated by Carl Rogers, a famous psychologist who's best known as the founder of client-centered therapy. And just as his approach to therapy was client-centered, he takes a very humanistic approach to learning, which is that learning should be student-centered and that learning is natural. Teachers don't even have to be involved in the process. I didn't have anyone teach me how to make a Google drawing, which I did to put this graphic on the page. I just jumped in, tried to make it, made a bunch of mistakes along the way, reflected on my mistakes, made some changes, tried it again, and went along like that in a learning cycle without a teacher ever being present. So if self-initiated and student-centered learning is the best learning according to Rogers, who was himself a teacher, where is the teacher involved? And so Rogers saw the teacher as important in the process as a facilitator, and that the teacher should really focus on preparing and curating the best resources to stimulate student curiosity and to allow a student to delve into a process of constructing his or her own learning. He also believed from his background as a psychologist that it's really important that students not feel threatened during the learning process, that people are very rigid when they feel under threat, and so that they learn better when they don't feel like there are any threats to the self. So how does that relate to this research process model of guided inquiry design that's used in so many schools today? Well, that explicit focus on psychology of students and on students' emotional experience through the research process does connect very well with guided inquiry design because it's based on the work of a scholar in librarianship called Carol Kuhlthau, who over many decades has observed students in the information search process. And she was able to articulate the various stages of emotional roadblock and overcoming emotions and how student emotions through the process influence their actions during research. And so she and Leslie Maniotis built a structure for guided inquiry where the teacher is the facilitator through a process that helps students get over those natural roadblocks in the information search process. Guided inquiry design structures that teacher guidance and teacher facilitation of the process. Guided inquiry design is divided into 8 distinct phases. The first 2 are explicitly teacher-directed, and the following 6 are mostly teacher-facilitated and student-centered. In those very 2 important first stages, the teacher invites students to begin inquiry by opening their minds and stimulating curiosity. And then in the immerse phase, which may be a whole group activity, they're helping students to build background knowledge and connect to the content that they will begin to investigate so that they can discover ideas that are of interest to them. And then we lead into this very explicitly student-centered process of exploration. So the explore phase, students get to follow what they're most curious about and what they're most interested in order to identify an inquiry question. And only then do they begin to gather information. So there's a lot of work that's done in those explore phase, explore and identify phases before students even explicitly start that research, what we consider the research process, where they begin to take notes and gather information explicitly on a narrowed topic. But students are still leading this process with teacher facilitation until they get to the point where they are creating a product that demonstrates their learning, reflecting on their learning, and they're figuring out how they can make their own meaning of what they've learned in order to share it with others and learn from others. Until we get to the very last phase, which is evaluation, and that's one that's both teacher teacher-led and student-centered, because student reflection is a really important part of this process. So how can we explicitly connect that experiential learning with guided inquiry design? What I did was I pulled out what I think are the most important elements of the experiential learning theory that makes it different. There are 5 characteristics of the teacher role, which I think are explicitly different in experiential learning, and then characteristics of the learning itself, having that element of student control, a focus on problems that are important to the student and have practical or social relevance to the student, and that there be an element of self-evaluation in the student process. So what I did was connect those, and so you can see the blue bubbles that I created there are about those elements of the teacher role, and I connected them to specific points in the guided inquiry process. So the first 2 at the bottom, setting positive climate and clarifying purpose, that Rogers thought were important, are really explicitly built into those first 2 teacher-directed stages of open and immerse. And then where teachers focus on curating the resources, you can see which phases that is particularly important in. And then this whole idea that teachers should really not be dominating the process. They should share their thoughts with students and help students through the process, but not dominating students. That we see throughout many of the phases of guided inquiry design. And then if we look at the characteristics of learning, I think the most important is that element of student control. And you see that that is present, student focus or student control is present in so many phases of guided inquiry. And I explicitly pulled them out over there on the left, where there are elements of student control. And then self-evaluation being there not just at the very end of the process, but explicitly as part of gather, create, and share as well. I think a lot on the significance of the connection between experiential learning theory and guided inquiry design when I think about that quote from Rogers about making sure that we don't introduce elements of threat into the learning process. And when I think about how we can integrate experiential learning theory usefully in our implementation of guided inquiry design, it is in this connection of, in this theme of the teacher as a facilitator who connects with learners, who is a curator and a coach, not the owner of knowledge who has to transmit knowledge, and who guides students through a process. But that an overarching idea that we need to make sure that learners feel respected and safe in this process so that they can take risks and deeply integrate their knowledge. I feel like I took a lot of risks in this process by utilizing some tools I had never used before. So I created this presentation with Zoho Show. I built graphics using Bubble.us and Google Drawing, and I recorded it in Screencastify. My image sources are cited below, and the sources of the research that I used for this presentation are here. Thank you for listening.